Hello, everyone. My name is Steve, and welcome back to American Steam Legacy. By 1915, the six-coupled switcher was quickly becoming obsolete, but the U.S. entry into World War I and the creation of the United States Railroad Administration gave the once venerable 060 a temporary reprieve. In 1917, the USRA's Builders Committee, chaired by Samuel Vauclin, selected six locomotive types to be standardized with a heavy and light version of each, bringing the total to 12. For switching and transfer service, the six-coupled switcher was selected as the light version, while the eight-coupled variant was the heavy. The 010 wouldn't appear until 1919, and the 010 would arrive even later than that, so they weren't considered among the locomotive types already in service. Coming up next, we're going to take a look at the standard switchers of the USRA, their origins and post-war fate on American Steam Legacy. Right from the start, the Builders Committee was not going to develop their standardized locomotives from scratch. Instead, they chose to identify examples already in service that have established track records of sound design and high performance. The six-coupled switcher of the Chicago and Northwestern and the eight-coupled switcher of the Washington Southern were selected as the basis for the heavy and light USRA switchers. The Chicago and Northwestern Railroad had two variants of the six-coupled switcher, a light version used for switching and a heavy version for transfer service. It was the heavy 060 of the M2 class that was chosen as the template for the USRA. The M2 class switchers had proven themselves capable locomotives in both yard switching and transfer service. The M2s could handle up to 3,000 tons on grades of just under 1%. The USRA light switcher was almost identical to the M2 class. A slight increase in boiler pressure, an additional 6,000 pounds in locomotive weight, and an extra 2,000 pounds in tractive effort round out the differences. In total, 255 USRA light switchers were produced. One of the railroads receiving an allotment of these locomotives was the Chicago and Northwestern itself. Overall, the USRA standards were well received. The USRA 060 was deemed satisfactory in both switching and transfer service. Even though the similarities between the USRA and the Chicago and Northwestern switchers outnumbered their differences by far, that didn't prevent the engine crews from voicing a preference for the M2 class. They claimed the M2 class was more satisfactory than the USRA standard, but provided no details as to why. The USRA 8-coupled switcher was developed along similar lines and met with the same reception by the railroads. The Builders Committee based the USRA heavy switcher on a Washington Southern design of 1914. Like the standard six-coupled switcher, driver diameter was kept at 51 inches. Cylinder bore was increased to 25 inches compared to 24 inches for the Washington Southern model. Tractive effort saw a modest increase of 1,600 pounds, and boiler pressure was reduced to 175 psi. 175 USRA switchers were produced, with most going to railroads in the eastern, midwestern, and southern districts. Only 4 railroads west of the Mississippi received an allotment of the heavy switchers. One railroad in particular was rather impressed with the USRA 8-coupled switchers. The New York Central seemed to make the USRA design the standard for the road until the end of the steam era, while only making small changes to the design. Other railroads weighed in with some positive feedback as well. The Northern Pacific deemed theirs very satisfactory and citing fuel and water consumption as very economical. The Atlanta and West Coast voiced similar praise and gave high marks to the superheater. But the railroads being as they were and having a preference for locomotives built to their own tastes, the complaints came in left, right, and center. Both 6 and 8-coupled switchers spawned the same negative feedback. Complaints such as the tender coal pushers being superfluous, the cab is made out of steel instead of wood, and the length and location of the throttle handle being wrong. Even the location of the pilot beam footboards drew the ire of at least one railroad. These complaints were mostly due to the railroad's preference for locomotives built to their own specifications, and the USRA was very much aware of this. As the complaints came in, the USRA would pencil whip them with an argument to the contrary or by referring to applicable federal safety standards. When one railroad complained that the ashpan rigging and non-lifting injectors were mounted too low and are subject to damage and a derailment, the USRA responded by saying that these things cannot be considered design defects since derailments are a matter of operating conditions. The USRA added that pilot boards and brake hangers were also subject to damage under the aforementioned circumstances. There were, however, two complaints that the USRA not only took seriously, but actually took action to remedy. The tenders supplied with both the 6 and 8 coupled switchers were the same tenders used on USRA road engines, such as the Light Pacific. Switchers typically had a slope-back tender, or a tender where the top of the coal space is narrower than the water tank for better visibility when running in reverse. The large tenders that came with the USRA switchers were very unpopular for this reason, and the fact that the engineer had to hang out the cab window in order to get a better view when running in reverse. The USRA tried to correct this by modifying existing tenders or supplying new ones. The other complaint pertaining to the throttle handle was also addressed. The USRA allowed design changes that included a longer throttle lever, retaining bolts added to the balancing ring, and regulating the lift of the balancing valves. The USRA may have agreed to these changes due to the commonality of parts, not just among the switchers, but because some components were shared with road engines as well. The heavy and light switchers shared things like driving axles, driving boxes, firebox grates, cab fixtures, and coal pushers. Parts in common with USRA road engines are dome caps, couplers, coupler drawbar, and cylinder and gauge cocks. The differences between the switchers and other USRA types are mostly superficial. The bell and headlight placement seemed to be borrowed from the Pennsylvania Railroad. The switchers received footboards instead of pilots, and the boilers were of the straight or telescoping type instead of the conical boilers found on road engines. The boilers also lacked combustion chambers, which is a feature they shared only with the Light Pacifics. In the years following the end of World War I, only 8 railroads ordered copies of the USRA 6-coupled switcher. This wasn't necessarily an indictment of the USRA design, but more of an indication of the 6-coupled switcher having outlived its usefulness. The 8-coupled switcher enjoyed the greatest longevity. By 1949, the Chesapeake and Ohio was converting to diesel power with their first order of Alco S2 switchers. The Rhodes C16 class heavy switchers, which were modernized USRA designs, became surplus. 15 C16s received from Baldwin in 1943 were put up for sale on the used locomotive market, and the Norfolk and Western Railroad, still completely dedicated to steam, was all too happy to buy them at rock-bottom prices. The Norfolk and Western, being very pleased with the former Chesapeake and Ohio engine's performance, built 45 virtual duplicates which would become the S1A class in 1953. The last locomotive of this class, number 244, built in the Norfolk and Western Roanoke shops, would be the last steam locomotive built for service on U.S. common carrier railroads. Unfortunately, none of the S1A class switchers were preserved. Over 1,200 copies of the USRA 8-coupled switcher would be produced between 1919 and the end of the steam era, making the 080 the most copied USRA design. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. And once again, my name's Steve, and thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.